Welcome to week 9 of the QUT Design Lab series of videos supporting our program based on Wendy Belcher's second edition of Writing Your Journal article in 12 weeks. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara peoples as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands in Meanjin, where I'm recording this, and I recognise that these have always been places of teaching, learning, research, creativity, storytelling, and arts. I'm your writing wellbeing coach, Dr. Abby Winter, and this week we're talking about strengthening the structure of your article. So it's going to be a longer video because Belcher has a lot of content about this. But first, our weekly writing reflection. Do you visualize or lay out your writing? If so, how? For example, Zerubbabel on page 84 of the book The Clockwork Muse talks about having an easel beside his writing desk and printing out each paragraph and section's topic sentence to stick on the sheet for the section he's working on. You might use a mind map or an outline or a series of index cards or something I haven't even thought of. How do you visualize your writing? What works for you? Now, this week we're going to be talking about structure. But first, Belcher has offered that those who tweet, do we still call it that, can send her hashtag WYJA8, W for Write Your Journal article 8 weeks in, to @WendyBelcher, and she'll send you back a congratulations for being 3/4 of the way through her book. The point of understanding the structure of your article is, like pretty much everything else we do, to help strengthen your argument. Don't just blindly follow what others have done before or whatever the standard conventions are, whether that's for your field or for the journal or other place that you're submitting to. Take a few minutes to actively and critically think about whether the structure of your article is helping you present your evidence and make your argument in the best way possible. Belcher talks about 2 types of structure in your piece of writing, the microstructure and the macrostructure. The microstructure can be diagrammed at the level of paragraphs and sentences and talked about in terms of your work being clear and cohesive or fitting together well, while the homework was an example of the macrostructure because that's how the sections hold together to make a coherent whole. Next week and the one after, we'll be looking at the level of the microstructure of your piece of writing. This week, we're just looking at the macrostructure because it helps once in a while to get out from among the weeds that you're writing in, to see the forest as a whole. On page 259, Belcher describes the 5 main types of macrostructure in a piece of academic writing. The first is description, where you organize by the characteristics of the information, the who, the what, where, and when of the topic. Usually, you'll use a descriptive macrostructure in the introduction, background, and methods. Signposts of description are phrases like, for example, such as, that is, or some features are. Pure description isn't enough, though. You also do still need some argument. Next is sequence, where things are in order, usually chronological. It's the detective novel we don't want to be writing, but sometimes it's important to lay out things in the order that they happened so that the context is there for our argument. Indicator words for sequence are first, second, next, before, or more recently. The third type of macrostructure is causation, where there's a cause and effect relationship. First this, then that. We often use this type in our results and discussion sections, and it's very common in published academic articles. Words that indicate causation are words like because, thus, as a result, or therefore. Fourth is problem solution, where you ask a question and then answer it, presenting the problem and then its solution. This is also common in the discussion section and in published academic articles. Signpost words and phrases for it are the question is, the puzzle facing, proposes, or responds. Finally, the 5th type of macrostructure is comparison. Here, you look at how things are the same and how they're different. It's common in literature reviews and in published articles. Keywords and phrases are in contrast, instead, on the other hand, both, and similar. Do you recognize any of these types of macrostructure in your writing? Do you have a preference? Belcher makes the point that the structure isn't enough. You need to have things in the right order. She talks particularly about 2 ways of ordering your writing. Firstly, by starting where your reader is and taking them on your journey, which is called the reader knowledge-oriented order. Go from the easy or familiar or historical to the more complex and challenging. Her other preferred option is Eric Hayott's Uneven U, where the start and end of your paragraph are more abstract. Hayott goes into a lot more depth about it in his 2014 book, The Elements of Academic Style. But basically, you start your paragraph with a general statement, then get into the depths of detail with your evidence or example, and then come back up to something more general so you can move on to your next point in your next paragraph where you're using the uneven U structure to order your writing. And just quietly, it applies to sections and even chapters in dissertations and books as well. So think about how to order things in your writing. So we finish ordering. Next is structuring. There are 5 structure signals that good writers use, 4 S's and a Q. Subheadings make your work more readable, both in terms of speed and comprehension. A synopsis gives your reader a map to what they're about to read, and it only need be 2 or 3 sentences. Using summing up sentences at the end of each section, and sometimes a really heavy paragraph, helps your reader stay with you as you present your evidence and build your argument. You can also use summing up sentences at the start of sections to give a preview of where you're going next. If you're changing direction, using switch signaling words is really helpful for your reader. Things like nevertheless, however, in contrast, and on the other hand. Let your reader know that you're now going to present something different to what you've just been talking about. Finally, posing questions can be helpful, but only if you make sure that you go on to answer the question soon in the next section. Belcher spends a few pages going through different types of structures for newspaper and magazine articles, editorials, blogs, and the like. But then on pages 267 to 268, she outlines the 2 main types of academic writing outlines: introduction, literature, method, results, discussion, conclusion, or introduction, body, summary, conclusion. Think for a moment about what your broad macrostructure is. In the humanities, we may often intertwine our results and discussions, so that normal macrostructure is probably the simpler intro, body, conclusion. The next thing to think about is whether your discipline has norms that you need to follow. Then think about the journal or other outlet that you're writing for. Do they require a specific macrostructure or way of organizing your writing? Okay. The next thing Belcher talks about on pages 270 to 273 is the usefulness of doing a post-draft outline of your piece of writing with the direct intent of improving its structure. Now, post-draft outlining is not reverse outlining, where you take your text and create the outline of your article from the text you've already written. Post-draft outlining is a more creative and often visual or verbal process that you can use when you feel like something just isn't quite working. She gives lots of examples of ways to do it, including visual tools like mapping and flowcharting and storyboarding. But I want to spend a few moments on 3 in particular that I find useful. First is what she calls the make it social outline. Here, you find a willing person and tell them the story of your article. I love this one because a lot of good back-of-the-brain thinking can actually come to the surface when you start talking about things, especially if you're stuck. Her next one is Brian Herrera's motivation outline. Here, you make a 2-column table for your outline. In the left-hand column, you outline what's happening in your piece, the opening, the literature, the various bits of evidence and argument you go through. In the right-hand column, you write down your own motivation or big idea that's behind each section. There's a really nice real-world example on page 272 from one of Herrera's articles. The last one she recommends is Klim's question outline. Here, you do your outline as a series of questions. Instead of writing define branding, you would write, in what ways could branding be defined? The big recommendation here is to ask in what ways questions rather than how questions, just because how takes you down a single linear pathway, whereas in what ways opens up multiple possibilities and lets you make a much stronger and better evidenced argument. Finally, on page 273, Belcher outlines the 5 structural elements of a good article, like the one you hopefully deconstructed for your homework. She suggests you think about length, both overall and for each section. Signposts such as subheadings or the placement of illustrations or tables, where the argument first appears and whether it threads throughout the piece or is just at the start and end, which would be bad. And how many citations it has, and what you learned from it. That's all the content for this week. Your homework for next week comes in a couple of parts. Firstly, take what we've talked about today and do some playing around with your piece's structure. Pick one of Belcher's post-draft outline methods on pages 270 to 73 and do it to your piece, whether that's turning your structure into questions, mapping it out visually, talking it through with someone, or doing your motivation table. Then make yourself a list of things to do to improve your piece's structure. Next week, we're going to get into the microstructure and start with the beginning and end of your piece. So, your second piece of homework is an easy one for those doing the QUT Design Lab program. Email through the current title for your piece. And of course, plan and track your writing time. See you next week.